and welcome to the top 10 most likely unseen issues for the November 2018 strategic case study on pharmaceutical organization Novak.
So before we start, I'm just going to go through a bit of an introduction to this particular video and where I've got the information on and what you need to do with said information. So how have I come up with these top 10? Well, first of all, you look at the focus in the pre-scene. If there's a lot of material in the pre-scene on a certain topic, then it's likely that there is some kind of importance of that topic. It's likely to be brought up in the exam, so there's more to talk about. And that feeds into the second point here, the degree of importance attached to it by the examiner. But that particular section extends beyond purely what's in the pre-scene, but also what CIMA like to examine. For example, ethics. It may be that there's no real mention of ethics in the case study, but ethics is considered very important by CIMA, and therefore they are likely to examine it. Next is the strategic importance. How important is it to the organization? If a certain topic is very important to the company, for example, say their suppliers. If they rely very heavily on a certain supplier, then it's likely that there might be an issue on the supplier. If something were to happen to that supplier, what impact could that have on the business? And also, just a more general experience in doing these videos in creating mock exams and reviewing exams in the past, the typical kind of issues that come up, and what kind of things have the examiner brought up in the past. And my final point here is about how easy it is to write issues on that subject. The people who write the exams are obviously people too, and they will go for ones that they know, that they can write good questions on. So what do you need to do for these issues? Well, first of all, it's important to prepare key models. So this will be things like your SWOT exam, like SWOT analysis, like your PESTLE analysis. Because building up this information now will help you to adapt the new information given you in the unseen, or help you to have that context to apply the unseen material. Next we need to do is practice exam questions on these issues. This will help you to understand the kind of questions that will be asked around these topics and how to answer them. And also, this next section here, it will help you to plan these answers in your mind so that when you go into the exam and you start writing, you'll already have a background in which to apply this new information. You'll already have certain points to bring up in your head as you're writing for them. And I've also put some more generic things here, such as the advantages and disadvantages of these certain topics, where they would be used and how models can be used to support them. So let's move on to the top 10 issues now.
And the first issue we are going to look at, issue number 10, is that of risk management. The reason why I've chosen risk management as one of my top 10 most likely unseen issues is because it is a key P3 topic. It features in most case study exams and is a sizable portion of the P3 syllabus. And of course, for the strategic case study, we have to have a reasonable proportion of P3, F3 and E3 in the actual exam. And generally what the questions would revolve around in the strategic case study exam would be that of risk identification, looking at a project or looking at the organization as a whole and identifying the key risks running through the organization. There were plenty of risks in the pre-scene. In fact, there was an entire section covering the key risks. But not only that, there were plenty of other risks that were present in the pre-scene but weren't mentioned in that risk report. And that in itself is perhaps an indication of poor risk management running through the organization, because there were risks such as litigation risks, there were risks over patents, things that were really prevalent throughout the pre-scene, yet they weren't mentioned in the risk reports. And other things that you need to bring up when you're talking about risks be the various techniques in which you can use to manage risks, such as the cost of risk model, and also the TARA model. Mapping your risks using risk registers, which is a more superior way of monitoring your risks other than a standard risk report, because you are attributing a likelihood and a impact factor to those different risks. And also looking at the various controls that you have in place at your organization. There was no mention of an audit committee or a risk committee, for example, in the pre-scene. And also it's recently and regularly examined. It generally comes up not necessarily as its own topic, but it comes up as part of other topics, perhaps analysing the risks of a new project, analysing the risks of a new acquisition, etc., regularly. And it's something that even if you're not specifically asked to talk about, you need to mention when you are answering your questions. You need to integrate those various risk factors into the question, even if the question not specifically asking about the risks, because the risks are often the downsides to any kind of project. So likely issues that could arise, it could be identifying the key risks in a specific project. Perhaps the organization wants to undertake a move into a different market. Perhaps they want to enter a market that they don't currently have a presence, a different country, for example. Or it could be that they are looking to break into the veterinary market or the other healthcare market, which was also hinted at in the pre-scene. So what kind of risks would the company face as a result of that? It would be opening itself up to new competitors. It would be a market it doesn't have experience in, and therefore it perhaps may not be able to access that market as easily as it could enter a new market in the field that it currently operates in, the pharmaceutical healthcare market. And what kinds of ways can we mitigate that? Could it be to work with an organization that's already present in that market to reduce the risk? It could also be looking at general risk management, be that on a project or for the organization as a whole. What kinds of risks are not being covered as well as they could be? Which ones are not being effectively mitigated against? And how can the organization improve on that? Or even how risks should be managed in the company. Perhaps there needs to be more of an audit committee, and the job of the audit committee is to ensure that the culture of the organization is set up to avoid risk. We know that reputation is so important in the pharmaceutical market. Doctors aren't going to prescribe medication if there is not, or if there's no trust within the organization. If they do not trust Novak products, they're not going to prescribe Novak products because they themselves are bound by their own standards and their own ethical obligations. And so some key points to bring up when you are answering a question, when you are mentioning risks in your exam. Got several risks that were outlined in the pre-scene, such as competition, how Novak is not one of the major players, and how simply releasing a new successful product can alter those rankings, how having a product go out of patent can cause you to drop in those rankings. And that you mentioned in the pre-scene that Novak has had a couple of products go out of patent, and as a result competitors have created generic products that have taken a lot of business away from Novak. And so we need to look at perhaps our release plans and plan to have certain products being released at a time that coincides with a patent expiring, so that we are mitigating, reducing the amount of time where we perhaps have a reduction in intangible assets and thus a reduction in intellectual property. And thus we're reducing the impact of those generics taking our business, because as soon as we've got one product expiring, we've perhaps extended the patent, or we've got a new patent for a new product to take up the slack. Reputation, a big thing in this industry. As I've already mentioned, reputation is key, because prescribers, doctors, pharmacists won't prescribe medicines if they don't trust the organization. And also how to break that habit as well. It mentioned in the pre-scene that doctors often will just prescribe this particular drug. This drug is the drug that they prescribe when a patient has this issue, and that's just what they've always done. And it's very difficult to then go to that doctor and say that actually it'd be better if you prescribe our drug because our drug does this, this, and this, because it comes across as salesy perhaps, or it's just something that they are accustomed to doing. Well, they've never had any problems prescribing this drug. Why would they risk their own professional reputation by prescribing something different? So information, knowledge, passing that knowledge on is incredibly important. Risks to the strategy as well. Anything that goes against the strategy would be a risk. They are a company that wants to help mankind or humankind. It wants to help cure diseases and to help with ill health. So anything that goes against that strategy, even if it's going to be profitable, is perhaps something that you should be suggesting they don't do, because we run the risk of going against our strategy, which means we lose focus. Governance and staff. Mentioned repeatedly how important staff were, how important knowledge is, having skilled employees is to this organization. And governance is going to be a big issue, or maybe a big issue in this pre-scene, because it specifically mentioned that there was a code of governance running in Cronland. And then it mentioned a lot about the board of directors in the pre-scene, suggesting that governance is going to be an issue. But unfortunately, if the Cronland Code of Governance is anything like the UK Code of Governance, there's a lot of governance issues that will be present in the exam, or that are present in the pre-scene, because there's a lot of codes of governance that they do not comply with. They don't have as many non-executive directors as they should do. They don't have the audit committee, the nomination committee, the remuneration committee, or at least there was no mention of them. They don't have any information about regular meetings with institutional shareholders and with the annual general meeting. Also need to talk about the importance of risk management as a whole and the importance of embedding a risk methodology throughout the organization. So you don't want risk to be a box checking activity. You don't want it to be something to force people to do at the end of everything they do as an arbitrary checklist requirement. You want it to be embedded in how they work, so they are automatically thinking about the risks. They're automatically taking steps to control their risks as they go about their daily work lives. There's some various theories you can bring up, such as the COSO risk methodology, which I've got a picture of on the screen right now. One thing as a bit of advice for when you are taking your exam, do not go through each stage of this. Don't go through internal environment, objective setting, event identification, don't go through subsidiary, business unit, don't go through strategic, operations, etc. Because you'll spend half an hour talking about it, and that's not what you're being tested on. You're not being tested on your ability to regurgitate information about the COSO risk cube. You just need to speak about it from a holistic perspective, how it's useful to embed risk management throughout your organization, or how it's a good way of identifying risks. Another model, the TARA model, transfer, accept, reduce, avoid. This can be quite a good one to run through if you are talking about potential ways to solve a problem. You perhaps talk about the project, talk about whatever it is that you are answering the question on, and then look at the 4 different ways of managing it through the TARA model. Can we transfer the risk? Can we outsource it? Can we take out insurance? Is it okay to just accept the risk, accept that's part of our business? If it is too likely to happen, or if it is too much, or it will cause too much of an impact, then perhaps it isn't right to accept. Are there ways to reduce the risk by taking out mitigating steps, such as if it's to do with trade overseas, can you mitigate that risk by hedging against it? Or could you avoid it by simply not entering this market altogether? Would it be beneficial to the organization to just avoid it? Yes, it could be profitable, but if these risks happen, it would actually do more damage to the organization than it would be profitable. And one way of looking at that is by looking at the risk mapping. So this is a better way, or risk register is a better way of analyzing risks compared with a standard risk report, because you look at the impact, you look at the likelihood, and then you can prioritize looking at how you would solve certain risks. If you just have a risk report, the temptation is to look at one by one, but if you can prioritize them by looking at the impact and likelihood, then you are putting all your effort into solving the ones that are going to do the most damage to the organization. Then once that's been solved, you move on to the second most damaging one, and so on, right until you get to the ones at the bottom which aren't going to have a big impact and aren't likely to happen. Also, need to talk about the fact that there was no mention of an audit committee. If they don't have an audit committee, that is a big failing in terms of governance, and it's also a big failing in terms of the way in which the organization runs risks or manages risks, because the audit committee are the top of the risk management pyramid, so to speak. This is where your risk management comes from. And they've got 3 non-executive directors, so they've got enough people to create an audit committee at the organization. So it's a real failing on risk management in risk management if they do not have an audit committee. Next, on to issue number 9, and issue number 9 is funding, which is another potential add-on issue. So similar to risk management, it's unlikely to come up as its own topic, but it is used regularly as part of other questions. And it's very commonly examined because, of course, we need cash for any investment in projects. And how are these projects going to be funded? It mentioned in the risk reports that getting funding for projects can be quite difficult, particularly if it's over 50 million dollars. So funding could be a potential issue. And there are other things you can talk about when you talk about funding, such as where funding comes from. Looking at your equity funding, how much money do we get from the stock market, from shareholders? Debt funding, how much do we have in loans from the bank? And also dividend policies, or quite a peculiar dividend policy potentially running through this organization. They paid out 9 billion dollars in dividends this year, despite making just over 10 billion dollars in profit. So that's an enormous amount to be paying out in dividends when we know that funding and reinvestment in the organization is crucial to success in this industry, because so many failed projects cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars, and the success of a few products needs to pay for that. So we need to be investing as much money as we can into research and development. That's one of the key critical success factors of this organization and of this industry as a whole. And so likely issues could be a long-term funding requirement, large-scale funding to undertake a new project or to purchase a new organization, or just to invest in research and development to expand Novak through organic growth. It could be also to do with short-term working capital. Cash flow is very important because there are lots of things that have to be paid for regardless of how much revenue you're generating, regardless of how much profit you're generating. Wages have to be paid, and we know that staff are very important. Costs such as paying our trade payables need to be paid regardless of how much revenue we've got coming into the organization. So having positive cash flow, even if it means just taking out an overdraft to ensure we have positive cash flow for a few months while we release a new product, etc., is very important. And it's most likely to be an add-on issue. So you're asked a question about a new project, then you talk about the risks of it, so there's the add-on in risk management. Then you talk about how you're going to get the relevant funding for it. There's the add-on in funding as well, but it's very likely to come. It comes up all the time as an add-on issue. Some key points to raise when talking about funding. That at the end of the year, they had nearly 7.5 billion dollars in cash and cash equivalents. Now that sounds great. That sounds like we've got so much to invest. But actually remember that a lot of this will be needed for working capital. We already have current liabilities, such as trade payables, of nearly 5 billion dollars. So a lot of that cash and cash equivalent is going to be paid to our trade payables, to our suppliers. We also need cash for monthly wages. And we may also have part of the organization's financial strategy to budget for negative cash flow. So we may have a strategy in place where we never have less than 3 or 4 billion dollars in cash and cash equivalents, because we need to have that money available if there are negative cash flows. So we don't just, what the takeaway here, what I'm trying to say to you is, don't go into the exam saying we have 7.5 billion dollars in cash and cash equivalents, therefore any project up to 7.5 billion dollars can be paid for out of cash and cash equivalents, because it's not that simple. Gearing is at 47 or 32%, depending on the method that you use. And what I mean by the method here is whether you use the debt over equity or debt over debt plus equity. Now, there is no correct method to use. as long as you explain the method that you have used and you use the same method every single time. And this leaves some extra room for debt funding because it's not quite high. It's not, approaching 100%, which would be very risky for a bank to lend you any more money. But they had just paid off a significant amount of their long-term debt, so it'd be unlikely that they want to take on any new debt at this point in time. But they do have a reasonable amount of assets that they could use to secure that debt funding, which would perhaps reduce the interest rate paid. Over 23 billion C$ in tangible assets. Although we have to be careful whether we can take out a fixed or a floating charge against these assets, because it's important that we are able to use those assets. We use those assets in the creation of our products. So if the bank wants us to not use it anymore to protect their asset, then that's going to cause problems with our operations. And generally, when you are talking about funding, the best way to structure raising funds is to use cash. For small projects, if cash is available, we have quite a reasonable amount of cash available. For small projects, it should be no problem. Things that are only maybe a few million C$, we can quite easily pay for. Failing that, we go to debt funding from the bank, secured against an asset base. And if that fails, if it's a huge, if we need hundreds of billions or tens of billions of C$, we may go to the market. Perhaps we may look to raise additional funds on the stock market. But this is always last because it's very expensive and it's very time consuming. And also it means that the other shareholders lose control of part of their holding. Is not worth as much once you've released more shares. And so they're not going to be happy about that either. And it has to be agreed with all the existing shareholders. So it's last for that reason. And when you're talking about funding, a good way to analyze it from a theoretical perspective is to look at the differences between debt and equity. For example, debt is much quicker, it's low cost, but the good thing about equity funding is that equity funding doesn't need to be paid back. You don't have to pay dividends. In fact, generally dividends aren't paid unless you don't have any reason to reinvest the money in the organization. Actually, we do want to be investing money in the organization. Another model that you can use is the Mendelow's matrix. Where would you put the position of your lenders and equity providers? Banks generally would fall into the high power, low interest, because as long as you pay your interest rate, they don't really care, but they have a lot of power if they were to foreclose on anything that you have raised finance against. And key shareholders may fall into the key players category. So this is the people with high interest and high power. And it's important that we place them in relevant positions, because it then is important when we are looking at satisfying our different shareholders, different stakeholders. We can prioritize the stakeholders that need to be satisfied first. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it, and more importantly, you have found it useful. I'd like to finish by just telling you a few things about the products that we produce here at Astranti and the ones that are part of our course. So these materials can all be purchased as part of the course or purchased individually. So we have our study text. We have 3 study texts for all the objective test exams. So 3 study texts for E1, P1, F2, F3, etc. But we also have the study text specifically for the case study exams, split into 2 parts. The first is about how to approach the exam, how to analyze the information, how to plan your answers, how to write your answers, and also the second part, which looks at the key theories from the objective test levels that are relevant to the particular case study. So if you are looking at P2, F2, E2 for the management exam, F3, P3, E3 for the strategic case study exam, and so on. We have our course videos, which look at how to plan your answers, how to manage your time effectively. These are the key reasons why people fail the exam. We have our pre-scene analysis, which looks at the pre-scene in a lot of depth, applies key information to that, and also concludes with the strategic analysis, where we look at the various different models in the CIMA syllabus and apply them to the case, and also the top 10 most likely issues to arise in your exam. Generally, we have a 70 to 80% accuracy rate on our top 10 issues. Our industry pack, which details in great depth the history and the current contemporary issues within the particular industry that the pre-scene is based on. We also have 20 to 25 industry examples that you can use within your answers. We have mock exams that can be purchased with or without marking and feedback, where you can get some real exam practice in, look for the kinds of things that the examiner is going to bring up in the exam, and also get marking and feedback from expert markers who have marked for CIMA and for us for many years, who know exactly the kinds of things that the examiner is looking for, exactly the kinds of mistakes that students often make, and can provide lots of detailed feedback to ensure that you improve on your performance. We also have our masterclasses, which are 2 day-long classes which look at all the key issues facing students in the exam. We will also go through live planning, showing you how to plan your answers effectively, how to write your answers effectively. Again, key things that cause people to fail the strategic case study exam, or any of the case study exams for that matter. And also, if you do sign up for our course, provided that you have filled out your forms, provided that you have submitted your mocks, provided you have done everything to show that you have really given it your all to try and pass this exam, we also offer a pass guarantee, giving a free resit to anyone who fails the exam.